The Harbor Chart House. Episode 6, Windows Above the Inner Harbor. A rectangular patch of harbor light rested across the elevation drawing. It began near the cream paper's lower edge, crossed a row of carefully drawn windows, and ended just above a roofline rendered in fine gray ink. Within that pale rectangle, the paper looked almost luminous. Outside it, the sheet kept the warmer color of old drawing stock, quiet and soft beneath the glass of the window gallery table. Nora Venn stood beside it without touching anything. She had arrived at the chart house only a few minutes earlier, and the pace of the evening was still settling into her body. The walk along the inner quay had left an even warmth in her legs. Her shoulders carried the small, familiar memory of her satchel strap. When she placed the satchel beneath the table, straightened, and let her hands rest loosely at her sides, she felt no need to begin at once. The light was already doing something worth watching. It had come through the first of the 3 tall window bays in the gallery. Beyond the glass, the sheltered harbor held the last brightness of the evening in long, broken bands. The water did not glitter. It moved too gently for that. Instead, it lifted and lowered the reflected sky by small degrees, so that the rectangle on the drawing seemed to breathe without changing its shape. The window gallery ran along one side of the chart house above the inner harbor. It was a narrow, comfortable room, long enough for 3 distinct views, but not so long that walking it felt like a journey. The bays divided the harbor into useful portions. From the first, Nora could see the lower quay roofs and the folded awnings above several familiar windows. From the second, the view opened around a line of trees and garden walls. From the third, the roof lines rose slightly toward the farther side of the water, where evening lamps would soon begin to repeat themselves in the harbor. Those 3 bays bounded her route for the shift. She would begin here, at the first window, and the drawing crossed by light. Later she would move to the middle bay, then to the final one. She would not make a circuit of the building. There was no reason to revisit the repair room, the model room, or the long map room tonight. Everything she needed had already been brought to the gallery and arranged on its central table. 3 old elevation drawings on cream paper, a removable viewing frame, a shallow tray of conservation tools, and the plain folders in which the drawings had rested. The evening's task was ordinary and unfinished. The 3 elevations had been catalogued, their dates checked, their paper condition noted, but their viewpoints had not yet been confirmed. Each drawing showed a portion of the harbor-facing buildings as seen from somewhere inside the chart house. The general matches were easy enough. A stepped roof line remained a stepped roof line. A broad wall still met a narrower one at the same angle. Yet awnings had changed, trees had grown, and small additions had softened some of the older outlines. The catalog notes needed to say which gallery bay belonged to which drawing, and what kind of comparison a reader could reasonably make from there. Not an exact match, Nora thought. A useful one. She looked down at the nearest sheet again. Its paper had the mellow surface of something handled carefully over many years. The drafting lines were precise without being severe. Window openings, cornices, drain pipes, and roof edges had all been given their proper place. But the drawing did not pretend the harbor had ever been motionless. A few awnings were shown lowered at different angles. One young tree rose beside a garden wall. Narrow strokes beneath several windows suggested reflected brightness rather than permanent architectural detail. The rectangular patch of light made those marks easier to see. Nora leaned forward slightly, keeping her hands behind her back. Her body had found the slower posture the gallery invited. Feet comfortably apart, knees unlocked, breath even. She could stand that way for a long time without tiring. Years of examining paper had taught her that stillness was not the same as stiffness. A useful pause could be active. The eye continued to sort tones and edges while the hands waited. Outside, water pressed softly against the stone quay below. The sound reached the gallery as a low, repeating fold, followed by a smaller retreat. Now and then the window glass gave back a faint reflection of the room, the pale table, the cream sheet, Nora's dark sleeve. And then the harbor brightness strengthened again, and the reflection thinned. Near the top of the drawing lay a short note in blue pencil. Jonas Reed had written only what was needed. 3 gallery views. Begin with light, not measurements. Nora smiled at the practical sense of it. Jonas's blue pencil appeared throughout the temporary catalog in brief, erasable guidance. It never competed with the documents, and it did not try to settle observations before they had been made. This note was especially restrained. The old elevations could certainly be measured, but measurements alone would not show how each view occupied its window. The first recognition would come from proportion, from the shape of open sky above a roof, from the way one wall entered the view and another left it. She read the note once more, then let it remain where it was. The removable viewing frame leaned against a padded support near the first bay. It was simple. A light rectangular frame, sized to sit safely against the inner window recess, without fastening to the wood or glass. Fine reference marks divided its edges into quiet intervals. When held in place, it would narrow the view just enough to compare major lines while leaving the actual window untouched. Nora did not lift it yet. That belonged to the first round of work. Arrival had its own use. She wanted to know the room before she began changing even its temporary arrangements. She walked to the near end of the table and checked the route with her eyes. The first drawing waited opposite the first bay. The second lay farther along, covered by a clean protective sheet. The third remained inside its open folder near the final window, where the light was cooler and less direct. The frame could move from bay to bay with her. No drawing would need to cross another. No folder would need to be carried back through a space she had already finished using. It was the kind of route she liked. Short, visible, and sufficient. At the first bay, she would compare the nearest roof lines. At the middle bay, she would look through the present trees, without treating their leaves as permanent architecture. At the final bay, she would compare the broader proportions of walls, roofs, and reflected light. By the end of the shift, the drawings would still be the drawings. The windows would still be the windows. And the catalog would contain a clearer account of how the two could be viewed together. That was enough work for one evening. Nora moved nearer to the glass. Below, the inner harbor remained sheltered by its enclosing quays. A small movement of water passed along the wall and altered the reflected sky. Across the way, striped awnings projected from several buildings. Some were fully extended, some half lowered, and one had been rolled into a neat cylinder above a window. Behind them, the roofline rose in shallow steps. She looked from the present roofs to the elevation on the table. The oldest broad shapes agreed. The smaller details did not always do so, nor should they. A tree now softened the corner of a wall that had once stood clear. An awning occupied a patch of open facade. One roof carried a narrow addition set far enough back that it barely changed the visible outline. None of these differences suggested absence or loss. They were the ordinary adjustments of a harbor still being used. The collection already had room for that kind of use. The walking map had shown familiar paths. The rain overlay had made the channels across the old plans easier to read. The ferry charts and the garden index held their own kinds of repeated movement and care. These elevations offered another layer. Not where a person walked, or where rain traveled, but what remained visible while the harbor changed in small, practical ways. Nora did not need to explain that purpose to herself. She could feel its continuity in the work waiting on the table. She returned to the first drawing. The patch of light had shifted no more than the width of a pencil line. But the change was enough to cut part of the drawn roof and cover more of the windows below. Its edges stayed straight because the window shaped it. Inside the rectangle, tiny variations in the paper's surface appeared and disappeared as the water moved beyond the glass. She placed one hand lightly on the table edge, away from the sheet. Her bone folder rested in the shallow tool tray. It had come from her former workshop and had grown smooth through years of use, though tonight it would serve only for gentle creases in temporary guards if they became necessary. Beside it were soft weights, narrow strips of inert transparent film, a ruler, blue-free annotation slips, and a pencil. Every tool could be removed again. Every action planned for the evening could be reversed. For now, the tools remained where they were. Nora took off her watch and slipped it into her satchel. The movement was unhurried and familiar. She did not need the exact minute while the room itself showed the progress of evening so clearly. Her breathing had slowed after the walk. The warmth in her legs had settled. When she rolled her shoulders once, they loosened without complaint. At the far end of the gallery, the final bay held a fainter band of sky. Its glass already reflected more of the room than the first window did. The middle bay stood between those conditions, neither bright nor dim, with the shapes of the trees moving gently across it. That sequence would guide the work. First bay, middle bay, final bay. No detours. She drew the protective sheet a little nearer to the second elevation, stopping before it touched the paper. This did not begin the comparison. It simply left the table ready. Then she checked that the open folder beside the third drawing lay flat, and that its ties were clear of the walking path. The changes were small enough to disappear when the work was put away, but they made the route calm and obvious. Outside, no boat hurried through the view. Nothing demanded attention. The harbor gave the gallery only water movement, roof lines, awnings, leaves, and the gradual exchange between daylight and reflected room light. Nora stood at the first window once more. She could now see why Jonas had told her to begin with light. The drawing did not need to be held up against the harbor, or made to coincide with every present detail. It needed a stable viewpoint and a patient eye. The rectangle across the sheet had already joined the room to the view more clearly than a list of dimensions could have done. Soon she would set the removable frame against the first bay. She would align the broad roofs without pressing for exactness. She would note which differences belonged to seasons, which could be changed again, and which had become part of the harbor's ordinary outline. But she allowed one more quiet interval before lifting anything. The elevation rested on the table, cream paper beneath pale harbor light. The frame waited beside the window. The three bays extended ahead in a simple line, each one already known as the next place she would stand. When the rectangle of light slipped clear of the drawing's lowest windows, Nora reached toward the padded support and placed both hands around the removable frame. Nora lifted the removable viewing frame from its padded support. It was lighter than its size suggested, made from thin, sealed wood with smooth corners and a narrow inner opening. Small reference marks divided the outer edges into even intervals. They were not measurements in themselves. They simply gave the eye a way to remember where a roofline entered the frame, where a chimney crossed the upper edge, or how much open sky rested above a wall. She held the frame with both hands and turned it once in the fading light. The underside carried 2 strips of soft felt. Nora checked them with her fingertips, feeling for grit or a lifted edge. Both strips were clean and firmly set. Nothing hard would touch the painted window recess, and nothing at all would touch the glass. She moved to the first bay. The elevation drawing remained on the table behind her, still lying flat. She did not carry it to the window or raise it toward the light. Old cream paper did not need to be made part of the view, when a few careful glances could carry the necessary shapes between table and glass. At the recess, Nora lowered the frame onto the broad inner sill. The felt met the wood without a sound. She kept one hand at each side while she adjusted its position, moving it a little to the left, then back by less than the width of her thumb. The frame leaned against the inner return of the recess, safely clear of the pane. When she removed one hand, it remained steady. When she removed the other, it stayed exactly where she had placed it. A visible border now enclosed part of the harbor. Within it, the stepped roof line across the water became simpler. The frame excluded a nearby drain pipe and most of the awning at the edge of the view. It left 3 broad roof planes, the upper portion of a pale wall, and a narrow band of sky. Water occupied only the lowest strip. Nora stood at a comfortable distance and let her eyes settle. She looked first at the whole arrangement, rather than at any one detail. The left roof entered near the frame's middle mark. The next rose gently before meeting a taller wall. Above them, the sky formed a long shape that narrowed toward the right. She turned back to the table. The first elevation held the same broad progression: a low roof, a shallow rise, then the taller wall. Yet the drawn sky seemed slightly more open, and the lowest roof began farther from the edge of the sheet. Nora returned to the window and shifted her stance, not the frame. Half a step to the right brought the present roofline nearer the proportions on the drawing. Half a step forward made the wall appear too large. She moved back again. There was no point at which every line agreed, and she did not search for one. The viewing frame was a guide to position, not an instrument for making the present harbor obey its earlier outline. She rested her hands loosely at her sides. Across the water, one striped awning was fully extended. It projected beyond the wall and interrupted a line that appeared clear on the elevation. Another had been rolled above its window, leaving only a narrow shadow beneath it. The young tree shown in the drawing had become broad enough to cover part of a corner and 2 lower windows. Those changes belonged to different kinds of time. The awnings could be raised before morning or lowered again the following afternoon. The tree would thin in winter and fill out in summer. Neither should be treated as a permanent alteration to the buildings behind them. Nora returned to the tool tray. She took out 3 annotation slips, a pencil, a small ruler, and 1 strip of inert transparent film. The film was clear and flexible, with no adhesive. It could lie over a protective support or rest beneath a soft weight, then be lifted away without leaving anything on the drawing. Beside the first elevation, she placed a clean support sheet. She laid the transparent strip on top of that support, keeping it separate from the old paper. 2 small weights held its ends flat. The strip had arrived with a slight curl. Nora reached for her bone folder. Its surface was smooth from years of use in her former workshop, fitting her hand without thought. She did not press the folder directly against the film. Instead, she folded a narrow paper guard over one end and drew the bone folder gently across the guard. The curl relaxed. She repeated the movement at the other end, then set the folder back in the tray. The transparent strip now rested level between the weights. That was the first clear change of the evening. What had been a loose, curling piece of film had become a stable working surface, ready to receive temporary marks. Nora aligned the ruler along its lower edge. With the pencil, she marked 3 short lines on a removable annotation tab tucked beneath the film. One indicated where the low roof entered the frame. One marked the rise toward the center. The last showed the meeting point of roof and taller wall. She did not trace the entire skyline. Too much detail would make the guide brittle in purpose, useful only under one set of awnings and leaves. 3 points were enough to recover the view. On the first annotation slip she wrote, "First bay. Broad roof sequence agrees. Compare structure, not awnings." The words were hers, so she used an ordinary graphite pencil rather than Jonas's blue. She placed the slip beside the support sheet, well clear of the elevation. Then she looked at the drawing again. A pair of awnings appeared in it, both lowered to shallow angles. Their positions did not match the present ones, but their construction did. Each was attached above a window. Each projected only while in use. The difference was plainly reversible. Nora added a second line to the slip. Awnings shown in another arrangement. She paused before writing anything about the tree. Leaves shifted even during the few seconds she watched them. A branch moved away from the pale wall, revealing a window edge, then returned. The elevation showed the same tree when it had been young enough to leave the wall almost entirely visible. She wrote, "Tree growth and leaf cover are seasonal parts of the comparison." That was precise enough. It recorded the condition without pretending the view had a single, permanent form. Nora left the frame in place and stepped back until she could see both the bordered harbor and the drawing on the table by turning only her head. The drawn roofline ran in fine gray ink. The present one rested in evening color, muted tiles, pale plaster, a shaded strip beneath the eaves. Their resemblance did not depend on exact coincidence. It came from proportion and sequence, low, rising, tall. Open sky narrowing toward the right. Water low in the view. She placed a small tick on the annotation tab beneath the transparent film. The three temporary reference marks were now joined by a light sloping line. Even this line did not attempt to copy every chimney or cornice. It held only the broad movement of the roofs. The working guide had begun. Outside, the harbor water lifted a band of brightness beneath the buildings. For a moment the lower walls appeared to rest on pale, wavering light. The elevation included a few narrow strokes in the same area, but Nora did not mark them as architecture. Reflected brightness changed with water, sky, and the angle of the window. It belonged to the evening's observation, not to the fixed outline. She wrote one final note. Lower light is reflected and variable. Then she set down the pencil. The first round of comparison had given her 4 useful distinctions without fastening anything to the drawing or window. The principal roof sequence was stable. The awnings were reversible. The tree cover was seasonal. The light below the walls varied with the harbor. All of it could be removed from the table in moments. The weights could be lifted, the film returned to its sleeve, the annotation slip placed in a catalog folder, and the viewing frame taken from the recess. The old elevation itself remained untouched. Nora checked its surface from a slight angle. The rectangular patch of harbor light had moved away from the lower windows, and now crossed a blank margin. Fine variations in the cream paper were visible there, gentle undulations left by its making and years of settled storage. Along the drawn facade, the ink remained even and calm. At the upper edge of the sheet, close to one corner, Nora noticed a tiny point where the light showed through more brightly. She leaned nearer, though not close enough for her breath to reach the paper. It was no larger than the tip of a fine needle. From where she stood, it might have been a pinprick in the sheet, or only a pale speck in the paper's surface. She did not decide. This chapter of the work was for establishing the first view, and the broad comparison was not improved by pursuing every minute mark at once. Still, she let her eye register its position near the edge. Then she straightened. A conservator's attention could remain open without becoming hurried. Small things waited safely when the material was stable and the sheet was stable. It lay flat, supported, and undisturbed. Nothing about the point required immediate action. Nora turned toward the window again. The frame still enclosed the same roofs, but the light within it had softened. The awning stripes were less distinct now. The pale wall had taken on a warmer shade, while the narrow sky above it remained clear. She stood at the chosen viewing position and checked the guide once more. Low roof entering near the middle mark. Shallow rise. Taller wall. Narrowing sky. The sequence held. She placed a second soft weight beside the transparent strip, not on it, marking the spot where the first guide would remain while she began the next part of the route. The completed marks were visible through the film. The support beneath them stayed clean. The old drawing remained fully readable beside it. Before leaving the first bay, Nora put the ruler back in the tray and turned the pencil so its point faced inward. She slid the bone folder into its usual place along the tray's padded edge. These small arrangements kept the table from becoming crowded as the work advanced. She did not remove the viewing frame yet. It would be useful to compare the first position with the next before resetting it. For now, it rested safely in the recess, holding a quiet portion of the harbor inside its narrow wooden border. Nora took one last look through it. A breeze moved the tree leaves. The rolled awning stayed rolled. The extended awning kept its shallow angle above the windows. Beneath them, the reflected band on the water broke into several soft lengths and joined again. Nothing needed to remain perfectly still for the comparison to work. She returned to the table and drew the protective sheet away from the second elevation. The motion was slow and level, revealing another expanse of cream paper from bottom to top. This drawing opened around a taller group of trees and a lower garden wall. Its roof lines sat farther back, leaving more sky above them than in the first view. Nora placed the protective sheet on the clear side of the table. The second elevation now lay ready opposite the middle bay. The first remained supported beside its temporary guide, its catalog slip recording only what the evening had shown. Between them stood the shallow tray, orderly and within reach. The bounded route was already narrowing. She had begun with the first window, learned the useful scale of the frame, and made a guide that favored broad proportions over exact agreement. At the middle bay, she would use the same restraint. She would change the viewpoint, not the method, and allow the trees there to occupy their present season without mistaking leaves for walls. Nora placed both hands on the sides of the viewing frame and lifted it cleanly from the first recess. The felt left no mark on the painted wood. The harbor view widened at once, giving the awnings, roofs, wall, and water back to the full window. Holding the frame upright before her, she walked the few quiet steps toward the middle bay. At the middle bay, Nora set the viewing frame on the broad inner sill. The felt strips settled against the painted wood. She moved the frame once to the right, where a cluster of leaves crowded its edge, then returned it slightly toward the center. From that position, the low garden wall crossed the lower part of the opening. The trees rose through the middle, and two roof lines held a quiet band of sky between them. She kept both hands on the frame while she found her stance. The middle window required her to stand a little farther back than the first. Its proportions were the same, but the view opened more gradually. At the first bay, the stepped roofs had established themselves at once. Here, the eye met leaves before masonry. Branches divided walls into pale sections, and the present evening arranged the foliage into overlapping shades of green. Nora let those shifting forms remain what they were. The trees had not been planted for the sake of the elevation drawing, and the drawing had not been made to predict every later branch. She looked through the spaces between leaves until the garden wall became continuous in her mind. Beyond it, the lower roof entered from the left. A taller roof appeared farther back on the right. The sky between them formed a shallow, open basin. She turned to the second drawing. On its cream paper, the trees were narrower and lower. Their trunks showed clearly above the wall, and there was enough space between their crowns to reveal most of the roofs behind them. Yet the broad proportions agreed with the window view. The low wall crossed the same part of the scene. The left roof began at a similar height. The taller roof rose beyond the trees rather than beside them. Nora returned to the frame and looked again. A branch shifted. For a moment, a short section of cornice appeared above the leaves. Then the branch eased back and covered it. Seasonal, she thought. She did not write the word yet. The first comparison had shown her how little information the guide truly needed. A few stable lines could carry the view, while awnings, leaves, and reflected light changed around them. She wanted to establish the middle position with the same economy before making another mark. She stepped half a pace to the left. The garden wall still agreed, but the taller roof moved too near the frame edge. Half a pace to the right brought the two roofs closer together than they appeared on the drawing. She returned to the center, then moved back until the frame's inner opening seemed nearly the same size as the drawn field. There the view rested comfortably. Nora did not force the wall into an exact alignment. She noticed instead where it entered and left, how much of the roof rose above it, and how the open sky balanced the trees. When she turned her head toward the elevation, the same balance remained. The middle bay belonged to the second drawing. That conclusion was straightforward. She could have recorded it at once. Instead, her attention returned to the tiny bright point she had noticed near the first sheet's upper edge. The second elevation had broad, undecorated margins. The fading harbor light fell across the paper at a shallower angle here, revealing a fine texture of fibers and a few soft changes in tone. Nora leaned over the table with her hands resting against its edge, safely away from the sheet. Near the upper margin, she found another pinprick. It lay close to the edge, not in the drawing itself. A second tiny point appeared lower on the opposite side. Both were clean and round. Neither had torn outward, and neither showed the irregular thinning that sometimes came from wear. Nora straightened and looked toward the first elevation. Its single visible point had seemed unimportant, because one small mark could have many ordinary causes. On the second sheet, the placement was more deliberate. One point near an upper edge, another across from it, both outside the drawn view. She moved the shallow tool tray a little farther from the papers, clearing the space between the first and second elevations. Then she lifted a narrow strip of clean support board and laid it across the table without touching either sheet. Its straight edge gave her eye a temporary line between the pinpricks. The line passed through the margins above the main elevation. Not through a roof peak. Not through a window corner. Not through any building measurement. Nora removed the support board and returned it to the clear side of the table. She looked at the removable viewing frame. The small reference marks along its edges had seemed evenly practical at the first bay, a quiet way of noting where the present roofline entered the view. Now she noticed that two of those marks occupied positions similar to the pinpricks on the sheet. One high along the left side, another lower on the right. She did not carry the drawing to the glass. Instead, she carried the observation from one place to the other. At the window, she stood at the established middle position and studied the frame's edge marks. At the table, she studied the drawing's pinpricks. The intervals were not apparent enough to trust by eye alone, but the relationship was possible. More than possible, she thought. It was practical. She took the small ruler from the tray. The ruler did not touch the old paper. Nora placed it on the clear support sheet beside the elevation, parallel to the drawing's left edge. Looking straight down, she noted the height of the upper pinprick relative to the image field. Then she repeated the observation along the opposite edge. She checked the frame in the same way, holding the ruler just beside the wood. The two positions agreed. Not with the precision of an engineering instrument. The frame was handmade. The sheet had responded slightly to age and humidity, and neither needed to supply a mathematical match. But the arrangement was too orderly to be incidental. The marks on the drawing corresponded to marks on the removable frame. Nora set the ruler down. The gallery seemed to become simpler around her. 3 drawings, 3 window bays, one frame intended to rest safely at each recess. small edge marks that allowed a sheet and a bordered view to share the same proportions without bringing the paper to the window. She went back to the first elevation. Now that she knew what kind of detail she was seeking, the second pinprick appeared readily. It lay near the opposite edge, faint in the softened light. The two marks bracketed the drawn view, just as the corresponding reference points bracketed the first harbor view through the frame. Nothing had been concealed in them. They did not encode a message or identify anything absent from the harbor. They simply showed how the elevations had been used. Someone had placed the frame at the window, selected two edge references, and transferred those positions to the paper. A visitor could then stand at the same bay and compare broad shapes without holding the drawing against the light or searching along the whole gallery for the correct angle. The pinpricks were part of a teaching method. Nora rested one hand lightly on the table edge. The discovery pleased her because it was so modest. The old arrangement had asked the visitor to do almost exactly what she was doing now. Stand in one place, look at a few durable proportions, and allow ordinary changes to remain visible. The frame did not promise that roofs, trees, awnings, or light would stay fixed. It offered a steady boundary within which change could be understood. She returned to the middle bay. The garden wall now lay in dimmer color. The trees had begun to appear less as separate leaves and more as broad, soft forms. Behind them, the roofs remained legible. The viewing frame held the relation among wall, trees, roof lines, and sky, without reducing any of them to a single permanent state. Nora aligned herself with the position she had chosen earlier. Then she lowered her gaze to the marks along the frame's sides. One fell level with open sky above the left roof. Another rested close to the place where the garden wall passed behind the fullest tree. Those points corresponded to the pinpricks in the second elevation's margins. From this standing position, the drawn field and the framed view would occupy nearly the same visual span. She moved half a step forward. The agreement loosened. She moved back. It returned. The method had included not only a window bay but a comfortable viewing distance. It did not constrain the visitor rigidly. A person could be a little taller or shorter, stand slightly left or right, and still understand the comparison. The marks provided a place to begin, after which the eye did the rest. Nora looked through the glass. The low wall in the drawing had been clearer because the trees were younger. In the present view, it came and went behind trunks and leaves. Yet the frame made the continuity easy to follow. A viewer could see what had changed without mistaking the change for a correction that needed to be made. She thought of Jonas's blue pencil note. Begin with light, not measurements. The instruction now had a second practical sense. Harbor light revealed the sheet's pinpricks. It also showed the changing conditions the elevations were meant to help visitors observe. Measurement could confirm the correspondence, but light made the use of it intelligible. Nora walked to the third drawing. It still rested inside its open folder near the final bay. She did not lift or shift the sheet. The room light was strengthening in the glass behind her, and the cream paper no longer held the broad rectangle that had crossed the first elevation. Even so, the margins were clear enough to examine. She began with the upper left edge. A pinprick showed there. The opposite mark took longer to see. Nora changed her own angle rather than moving the paper. When a faint reflection from the window passed across the margin, a second tiny point appeared lower on the right. Again, the pair lay outside the drawn architecture. She checked the viewing frame from where it remained at the middle bay. Its corresponding edge marks were already familiar. There was no need to measure the third pair immediately. 3 sheets carrying the same kind of marks, each associated with one of 3 gallery windows, established the use clearly enough for this stage of the work. Nora took a blank annotation slip from the tray. She wrote in graphite, paired pinpricks align with viewing frame references. Below that, after a pause, she added, "The drawings were prepared for comparison from the 3 gallery bays." She read the 2 lines once. They stated the observation without claiming more than the materials showed. The elevations might have served many visitors over many years, but she did not need to invent a scene of their use. The frame, the sheets, and the windows supplied the practical account. On a second slip she wrote, "A viewing aid, not part of the drawn architecture." She placed both slips beside the support sheet. The discovery changed the meaning of the temporary line she had made for the first bay. It was still useful, but it no longer needed to establish a viewing system of her own. A system already existed in the relation between the sheets and the frame. Her work could follow it gently, making that relation easier for present readers to use. She did not begin that work yet. This was the first interpretation, and she let it remain distinct from the choice that would follow. Before preparing anything for the atlas, she wanted to see the method operate at all 3 bays. The 3rd drawing had not yet been compared with its harbor view, and the existing temporary guide at the first elevation had not been adjusted to the edge references. Nothing was complete. Nora returned to the middle window and placed both hands on the viewing frame. Before lifting it, she looked through the opening once more. The garden wall crossed low behind the leaves. The 2 roofs held their places on either side of the trees. Above them, the evening sky had become a quiet, even blue. Her eyes moved to the paired reference marks. Now they were no longer merely convenient divisions on a wooden edge. They belonged to the cream paper waiting on the table. Together, frame and pinpricks preserved a simple instruction. Stand here, begin with these proportions, and notice the harbor as it is. Nora lifted the frame from the sill. The felt released cleanly, and the middle view widened to the full window. Leaves extended beyond the former border. More of the garden wall appeared at either side. The rooflines remained where they had always been, though the frame had made their relation easier to hold in mind. She carried it toward the final bay. Behind her, the first 2 elevations rested flat on the long table. Their tiny edge marks were almost invisible again in the gentler light. Beside them, the annotation slips held the discovery in plain words. Ahead, the 3rd drawing waited in its open folder, and the final window showed the broader roofs across the sheltered water. At that bay, Nora would test the same alignment once more. After that, she could decide how to make the old viewing method useful without fastening anything to the drawings, the frame, or the glass. She lowered the frame onto the final sill and kept her hands at its sides until it stood steadily in place. Nora stood at the final bay, with both hands resting on the sides of the viewing frame. Beyond it, the harbor roofs rose in a broad, shallow sequence. The nearest wall entered low from the left. 2 roofs stepped upward beyond it, and a farther roof settled the line before it reached the right edge. Water filled the lower portion of the view, carrying pale lengths of reflected sky beneath the buildings. She released the frame 1 hand at a time. It remained steady on its felt strips, clear of the glass. The 3rd elevation waited in its open folder beside the window. On the cream paper, the same sequence appeared in fine gray lines. Low wall, rising roofs, farther roof. The present roof addition she had noticed earlier was visible now as a narrow shape set back from the older edge. It altered one part of the silhouette without changing the larger proportion. Nora found the comfortable viewing distance by watching the paired reference marks. 1 step back made the roofs too small within the frame. Half a step forward brought the low wall too high. She eased back by the length of her shoe and stopped. The edge references now occupied the same relation to the harbor view that the pinpricks held around the elevation. She turned her head toward the drawing. The agreement was quiet but clear. It did not depend on the present color of the walls or the exact shape of the reflected light. The drawing and the window shared a field. The old pinpricks showed where that field began. Nora returned to the central table. The first transparent strip still rested on its clean support between two soft weights. Its temporary line recorded the broad roof sequence from the first bay, but it had been made before she understood the paired marks. She would not discard it. The useful portion was already there. It needed only a more practical boundary. She drew 2 fresh sheets of inert transparent film from their sleeve and placed each on a separate support. All 3 pieces were the same size. Each was large enough to carry a few comparison lines and small enough to rest inside a plain atlas pocket later, if the evening's tests approved it. They held no adhesive and would never need to touch the elevations directly. The second and third sheets curled slightly at their short edges. Nora folded a clean paper guard over the first curl and passed her bone folder across it with a slow, even stroke. The tool's familiar smoothness settled into her hand. It had followed her from her former workshop through many quieter rooms and many kinds of paper. And tonight its work was modest. Not forming a binding or sharpening a permanent fold, only persuading temporary film to lie flat. She repeated the action on the other edges. The curls relaxed. Nora placed soft weights at the corners, leaving the centers open and clear. 3 transparent working surfaces now lay along the table, one opposite each elevation. That arrangement made her next choice simple. She would prepare 3 comparison guides, but she would not trace 3 entire views. The pinpricks had shown her where to begin, and the first round had shown her what to leave out. Each guide needed the paired frame references and a few durable lines. Everything seasonal or reversible could remain visible through the transparency without being copied onto it. Nora placed a removable annotation tab beneath the first sheet. Using the small ruler, she transferred the 2 edge reference positions from her earlier notes. She made one short tick near the left edge and another lower on the right. Between them, she retained the light roof sequence she had already drawn. The first guide now contained only 5 useful marks. 2 references: the entering roof, the shallow rise, and the taller wall. She wrote on its separate slip, first bay, roof proportions. Nothing about awnings appeared on the film. That omission was deliberate. If an awning was rolled tomorrow, lowered next week, or replaced in another season, the guide would still work. A visitor looking through it could observe the present arrangement, without being told that the temporary fabric ought to match an earlier evening. At the first bay, Nora lifted the viewing frame from the final sill and carried it back along the short gallery. The room had changed since her first comparison. The harbor light no longer fell as a bright rectangle across the nearest drawing. Instead, the glass held a faint reflection of the table and the pale sheets upon it. Across the water, the awnings were still visible, though their stripes had softened into broad bands. She settled the frame on the first sill and returned to the established standing place. Holding the transparent guide by its clear margins, she raised it in front of her without touching the frame or window. The 2 reference ticks aligned with the corresponding marks on the wood. The broad roof sequence sat lightly over the present roofs. The extended awning crossed one unmarked area. The rolled awning occupied another. Neither interfered with the guide. Nora changed one variable. She lowered the transparency by a small amount while keeping her feet in place. The roof sequence no longer agreed, although her view of the harbor itself remained familiar. She raised it again. The agreement returned. Then she kept the guide aligned and moved half a step to the right. The taller wall drifted inward. The entering roof shortened. She returned to her original stance, and the proportions settled. Position first, she thought. She made no alteration to the roof marks. The guide had passed its first practical test. The references recovered the viewpoint. while the unmarked awnings remained free to show their present condition. Back at the table, she laid the first guide on its support and moved to the second. For the middle bay, the garden wall offered the most stable lower line. Nora marked where it entered the framed field and where it passed behind the central tree. Above it, she added 2 short roof strokes, one low on the left and one higher on the right. She did not outline the trees. Their present fullness would make such an outline immediately seasonal. Even the visible gaps between branches could close with a breeze and open again a moment later. The guide required only enough structure to let a viewer understand where the wall and roofs continued behind the leaves. She added the paired reference ticks and wrote, "Middle Bay, wall and roofs through present tree cover." At the middle window, she placed the frame as before. The garden had darkened into broad green shapes, and the wall appeared in calm, pale sections between the trunks. Nora raised the second transparency and aligned its reference ticks. The wall marks met the visible sections cleanly. The roof strokes appeared through openings in the leaves. She changed one variable. Keeping her stance and the guide steady, she looked first through a gap where the cornice showed, then waited as a branch moved across it. The marked roof line disappeared behind leaves. A moment later, part of it returned. The guide remained useful in both states. Nora did not shift the film to recover the hidden cornice. That would have mistaken changing foliage for a failure of alignment. Instead, she watched the garden wall, whose separate visible sections continued along the same low course. The middle guide required no additional line. She lowered it and looked through the bare frame. Once its few marks had established the proportions, the eye could do the rest. Trees could be trees. Their movement did not need correction. The third guide took even less drawing. Nora returned the frame to the final bay and placed the fresh transparent sheet on its support beside the third elevation. She marked the low entering wall, the 2 principal rises in the roof sequence, and the farther settling line. She added the paired reference ticks. The narrow roof addition did not receive a mark. It was a real part of the present building, not a passing awning or seasonal branch. But the older elevation did not need to be revised on the transparency to include it. A comparison guide could show where the broad lines continued and allow the later addition to remain visible as an ordinary change. On the separate slip, Nora wrote, "Final bay, broad roof sequence. Setback addition remains visible beyond the guide." The reflected light required its own restraint. In the old drawing, narrow strokes beneath several walls suggested brightness on water. In the harbor now, the reflections had lengthened. A lamp across the quay had appeared as a pale vertical band, broken gently each time the water lifted. Another reflection joined it farther along. Nora considered adding a lower reference line. Instead, she tested the guide first. At the established standing place, she aligned the paired ticks with the frame. The low wall and principal roofs agreed. The setback addition rose beyond an unmarked portion of film, easily seen and easily understood. Below, the reflected bands moved without holding any fixed length. She changed one variable. Keeping the roof alignment steady, she lowered her attention from the buildings to the water. The guide offered no instruction there. The reflections shortened, widened, and joined again while every architectural mark remained in place. That was the correct result. Reflected light belonged in the comparison, but not as a fixed outline. A visitor should be able to notice how it differed from the marks on the elevation, without finding a transparent line that claimed one evening's reflection as permanent. Nora lowered the guide. On its slip, she added, "Water light is observed through the clear lower field." She carried the frame back to its padded support near the first bay and rested it there. The 3 window recesses were again empty, exactly as they had been before her work began. No fastener had touched the wood. No film had touched the glass. Each view had widened back to the full proportions of its bay. At the table, Nora arranged the guides in order. First bay, roof proportions with awnings left untraced. Middle bay, wall and roofs with tree cover left open. Final bay, broad roof sequence, with the addition and water light visible beyond the marks. The differences among them were small and practical. More importantly, each guide changed only what its view required. She had not imposed the first skyline on all three, or filled every clear area simply because space remained. She checked the reference ticks once more against her measurements. The first pair agreed with the first elevation's pinpricks. The second pair agreed with the second. The third pair agreed with the third. All three followed the existing teaching method rather than replacing it. Nothing had been attached to the old sheets. Nothing had been declared finished. The guides still needed their clean protective leaves, their catalog wording, and the approval that would allow them to enter the reading room atlas after the garden index. Those were tasks for the narrowing return path, when Nora could leave each bay as she had found it, and carry only the approved comparison forward. For now, the visible work rested on the long table. 3 pieces of transparent film had become 3 distinct viewing aids. The first held a shallow rise of roofs. The second let the garden remain leafy around a low wall. The third preserved open space beneath the buildings so the harbor light could move. Nora placed a clean protective sheet over each guide, without covering its annotation slip. Then she moved to the final bay once more, carrying nothing. The frame remained on its padded support. The drawing remained in its open folder. Through the unobstructed glass, the broad roofs held the proportions she now recognized, without needing to measure them again. Low wall, 2 gentle rises, farther roof. Below them, reflected light lengthened across the sheltered water. Behind Nora, the 3 guides rested separately beside their drawings, ready for the next careful stage. Ahead of her, there was no farther window to test. The bounded route had reached its final bay and could now turn toward putting the useful work in order. She watched one pale reflection divide and join itself again. Then she looked back along the table toward the first guide, the second and the third, each waiting beneath its clear protective sheet. Nora began at the far end of the table, beside the third guide. Its protective sheet held a faint reflection of the final window. Beneath that reflection, the transparent film carried only the broad roof sequence and the 2 small reference ticks. The lower field remained clear for the moving light on the water. Beside it, the old elevation rested in its open folder, cream paper warmed by the lamps of the gallery. She looked from one to the other without lifting either. The practical question of the evening had narrowed to a simple form. The 3 drawings belonged to the 3 gallery bays, and the pinpricks at their edges showed how the removable frame had once helped visitors find those views. Nora's guides did not need to preserve the whole harbor. They needed to preserve the use of that quiet method. She read the annotation slip for the final bay. Broad roof sequence. Setback addition remains visible beyond the guide. Water light is observed through the clear lower field. The wording described exactly what the guide allowed. It did not ask the present harbor to look old, and it did not ask the old drawing to account for every later change. Nora placed a blank catalog slip below the note. In graphite she wrote, "Comparison guide for third gallery bay. Align paired ticks with viewing frame references. Observe present roof line and reflected light through unmarked areas." She left a little space beneath the final line, then added the elevation's catalog number. That was enough. A reader would know where to stand, what to align, and what to leave free. She moved to the middle guide. Under its protective sheet, the marked garden wall crossed a short distance before disappearing into clear film. 2 roof strokes rose above it. Nothing enclosed the trees. Their branches, leaves, winter spaces, and summer fullness would remain part of the view rather than part of the guide. Nora read its earlier annotation and prepared a second catalog slip. Comparison guide for middle gallery bay. Align paired ticks with viewing frame references. Follow wall and roof proportions through present tree cover. Again, she added the elevation number. At the first guide, the shallow rise of roofs looked almost spare. The awnings had been left entirely untraced. If they were raised tomorrow, the guide would still agree with the buildings. If they were lowered in another pattern, a visitor would see the difference at once without being told that anything was wrong. Nora wrote, Comparison guide for first gallery bay. Align paired ticks with viewing frame references. Compare roof proportions. Awning positions may vary. She placed the 3 slips in a straight line below the guides. The wording had become shorter as she went. That often happened when the material had been properly understood. At first, an observation needed room. Later, the useful instruction could become plain. She returned to the final bay. No frame stood on the sill now. Nothing interrupted the full glass. Nora took her place at the comfortable viewing distance and looked across the harbor. The low wall entered from the left. 2 roofs rose gently beyond it. The farther roof settled the line on the right. The narrow setback addition remained visible without disturbing the older sequence. Below, the reflections lengthened and shortened with the quiet movement of the water. She recognized the view before naming any of its parts. That was different from guessing. The proportions had become familiar through repeated looking. This bay held more water in its lower field than the others. Its roofs rose in a broad, unhurried progression. Its light seemed to gather below the buildings before returning from the glass. Nora turned toward the middle bay. There, the open sky rested in a shallow basin between the roofs. The trees occupied the center, and the garden wall continued behind them, whether or not every section could be seen. Even from the final window, she could remember the slightly greater distance at which the viewing frame had agreed with the drawing. At the first bay, the roofs stepped more quickly. The sky narrowed toward one side, and the awnings altered the facade without altering the larger arrangement. 3 viewpoints, each with its own proportions. She no longer needed to consult the catalog note to know their order. Nora went back to the table and removed the protective sheet from the first guide. Holding the transparent film only by its margins, she examined it against the pale support beneath. The graphite marks were light but legible. None had smudged. The reference ticks were clear enough to find without competing with the roofline. She lifted the support and checked the reverse. Clean. The same was true of the second guide. The third carried one faint, loose graphite particle near its lower edge. Nora touched a soft brush to the support beside it and drew the particle away from the film. The clear lower field became clear again. That small correction settled the guides for use. She did not call the entire evening's work complete. The elevation drawings still needed to be returned to their folders, and the table still held the tools and working notes. The final catalog sequence would be closed only after those ordinary actions had been carried out. But the comparison guides themselves had passed their tests. Nora brought 3 clean protective leaves from the stack already on the table. Each was thin, smooth, and cut slightly larger than its guide. She paired 1 leaf with each piece of film, then placed the catalog slip behind it. A reader could lift the leaf, use the guide at the named bay, and return it without touching the marked surface more than necessary. The packets required no adhesive and no permanent fastener. She aligned the edges with the small ruler. Where the protective leaves had held a slight curve from storage, she covered each edge with a paper guard and passed her bone folder gently over it. The familiar tool moved with almost no pressure. One edge settled, then another. The packets lay flat. At the first packet, Nora paused. The garden index had entered the reading room atlas during the previous evening's work. It gathered the hand-drawn plans of walls, paths, planted corners, and sheltered courtyards into an order readers could follow. These window comparisons belonged after it. From the garden plans, the atlas could move naturally toward the views above the inner harbor. Nora crossed only to the atlas stand already placed near the gallery table. The reading room atlas rested open at the garden index. Its approved leaves lay evenly, and the pages added during the earlier work had kept their settled alignment. She did not turn back through the walking map, rain overlay, ferry material, or garden plans. Their order was established and did not need another review. At the end of the garden index, 3 empty transparent pockets waited for approved material. Nora opened the first pocket. She slid the first bay packet inside, supporting its full width with one hand, while the other guided the edge. The protective leaf entered smoothly. The catalog slip remained upright and readable behind the film. The atlas, which had ended with the garden index a moment before, now carried one window comparison after it. She added the middle packet to the second pocket. Through the clear layers, the low wall and separated roof strokes remained easy to distinguish. The unmarked space around them seemed generous, rather than unfinished. It left room for the living trees outside the middle bay. The final packet entered the third pocket. Its lower field stayed open for reflected waterlight. Nora lowered the pocket leaf and let it rest flat. She placed no weight on the atlas and began no binding. That work belonged later, after all approved copies had been assembled. Tonight the guides needed only a safe position in the reading sequence. She stood with one hand resting beside the open atlas. The 3 packets followed the garden index without disturbing it. Their catalog slips named the bays in order. Their reference ticks preserved the relation among frame, drawing, and viewpoint. Nothing in them reopened the purpose of the collection or asked a reader to search for something missing. They extended the familiar record by one ordinary kind of use. People crossed the harbor by known paths. Rain followed channels. Ferries carried their lights along repeated routes. Garden walls guided movement through sheltered ground. From these windows, visitors had learned to look at the same harbor while awnings shifted. Trees grew, roofs acquired modest additions, and evening light changed on the water. The collection could hold those changes without trying to stop them. Nora closed only the empty protective flap beyond the third packet. She left the atlas open at the new window sequence, so Jonas could see where the guides had been placed. Beside the atlas, she set the 3 fuller working notes in catalog order. His blue pencil instruction remained with the elevation records, exactly where it had begun the evening. Begin with light, not measurements. The work had followed that advice and returned to it. Nora turned toward the old drawings. She started with the first elevation. Its folder lay open beside it, with the support arranged so the sheet would not need to bend. She lifted the folder board, not the drawing, and guided the cream paper into its resting position between the protective leaves. The tiny paired pinpricks nearly disappeared once the sheet lay flat. They did not need to be emphasized. The catalog slip now described their use, and the guides carried the corresponding references. The marks could remain what they had always been: small practical points at the edge of a teaching drawing. Nora lowered the upper protective leaf. She repeated the action for the middle elevation. The young trees drawn above the garden wall rested beneath the clean cover. Their present branches remained outside the window, fuller and darker in the deepening evening. The third drawing returned to its folder last. Its broad roof sequence was still visible until Nora lowered the protective leaf over it. Then the lines softened beneath the thin covering, and the cream paper settled into an even tone. She did not tie the folders yet. The final putting away belonged to the next quieter stage of the shift. For now, Each drawing was protected, each guide was in the atlas, and each window recess stood empty. Nora returned the ruler to the shallow tray. She turned the pencil inward. She brushed the paper guards into a small stack and placed her bone folder along the padded edge where it had rested at the beginning. The tool's pale surface caught a narrow reflection from the lamps and then became matte again when she moved her hand away. The route had shortened behind her. There was no reason to return to the first bay for another test. The awnings had already shown their reversible positions. No reason remained to wait for a gap in the middle trees. Their movement had already proved the usefulness of leaving them untraced. At the final bay, the setback roof addition and the shifting water light had both remained visible through the clear guide. The first bay was known by its quick steps of roof and narrowing sky. The middle bay was known by its low wall, central trees, and open basin of evening above them. The final bay was known by its broader rise of roofs and the greater measure of water below. Nora could tell them apart by light and proportion now. She carried the removable viewing frame from its padded support to the side of the table, where it had stood before the first comparison. The felt strips faced inward, protected from dust. Its edge marks remained visible, but they no longer needed to be studied. Nothing had been left against the windows. She walked to the first bay and looked at the sill. The painted wood showed no trace of the felt. The glass held only the room's faint reflection and the harbor beyond. At the middle bay, the sill was equally clear. The trees outside had become broad shapes, with the pale wall appearing between them in short, quiet lengths. She continued to the final bay and stopped. This was not another circuit. It was the end of the same short route, one established window after the next, narrowing to the place where the evening's comparisons had already concluded. Behind her, the atlas rested open after the garden index. The three guides lay flat in their pockets. The elevations rested under protective leaves, ready to be closed away without further interpretation. The tool tray was orderly. The viewing frame had returned to its support. Ahead, the final window held the harbor. The roofs were darker now, though their proportions remained easy to recognize. The low wall entered gently. Two rises followed. The farther line settled the view. Reflected lamps moved below them in pale vertical bands. Nora stood at the familiar distance without measuring it. Her feet found the place naturally. Her shoulders remained loose, and her hands rested at her sides. For a while, the harbor beyond the glass was clearer than the room reflected in it. Then the balance shifted by a small degree. The pale gallery table appeared across the darkening water. The cream drawing paper returned as a quiet shape behind her image in the pane. The frame, resting away from the window, showed only as a slim rectangle near the edge of the reflection. Nothing new entered the view. Nora could leave the final bay exactly as it was and begin the last settling actions from here. The useful comparison had been carried into the atlas. The drawings were protected. The three viewpoints had become familiar enough to recognize without a label. Water moved below the window in slow, sheltered folds. The reflected table grew a little clearer. Nora remained at the final bay, ready to let the room grow quieter around the work already in place. Nora remained at the final bay while the room's reflection gathered in the glass. At first it lay lightly over the harbor, the pale length of the gallery table, the cream drawing paper beneath protective leaves, the narrow shape of the viewing frame on its padded support. All of it appeared faintly, as though the glass had remembered the room without yet deciding to show it. Beyond the reflection, the harbor was still easy to see. The low wall entered from the left. Two roof lines rose beyond it. The farther roof settled the sequence toward the right. Beneath them, the water carried the lamps in long, quiet bands that drew together, separated, and drew together again. Nora knew the proportions now. She did not repeat them aloud or test them against the frame. Her feet had found the established viewing place without help. Her shoulders were loose. Her hands rested naturally at her sides, and her breath had taken on the slow rhythm of standing comfortably after useful work. Behind her, the 3 transparent guides lay in the reading room atlas after the garden index. The first left room for the awnings to change. The second left the trees untraced around the garden wall. The third kept its lower field clear for the moving reflections below the roofs. Their paired ticks corresponded to the old pinpricks and the marks on the removable frame. Each guide had passed through the simple test of being raised, aligned, shifted, and returned. Nothing more needed to be learned from them tonight. The elevation drawings rested under their protective leaves, though their folders remained open. The ruler and pencil had returned to the shallow tray. Nora's bone folder lay along its padded edge. The frame stood away from the windows, its felt strips turned inward. Only the last ordinary actions remained. Nora watched one pale band of light shorten on the water. It narrowed as the surface lifted, widened as the water lowered, and then became a long line again. No mark on the transparent guide attempted to hold it in place. The clear lower field had been the right choice. Tomorrow's light would have another length. Another evening would give it another tone. The view would remain usable through all of them. She turned from the glass. The final drawing lay nearest, inside its open folder at the end of the table. Nora took the few steps toward it without carrying anything. The gallery route did not widen again. She was not returning to the first or middle bay. She was only moving between the final window and the work already arranged beside it. The third elevation's protective leaf rested evenly over the cream paper. Through the leaf, the broad roof sequence remained softly visible. The low wall and 2 gentle rises could still be recognized, though the fine gray lines no longer asked to be examined. Near the margins, the paired pinpricks had disappeared into the even tone of the sheet. Nora placed one hand on the folder board. With the other, she drew the first folder tie across its cover. The tie moved smoothly and lay flat. She brought the second across it, keeping the tension light, and formed a simple bow that would open without strain when the drawing was next consulted. The folder closed around the protected elevation without pressing the paper. That was the first finished resting state. The drawing had begun the evening inside its open folder, waiting to be matched with a view. Now it rested within the same folder, its viewpoint confirmed, its teaching marks described, and its approved guide placed safely in the atlas. Nora slid the closed folder only far enough to settle it squarely on its support. She did not lift it or carry it elsewhere. The middle folder waited a short distance along the same table. Its protective leaf covered the drawn garden wall and the younger trees. Nora stepped beside it and checked that no edge of the sheet approached the folder fold. Everything lay correctly. She brought the ties together. The darkened trees outside the middle bay moved faintly in the reflection on the window glass. But Nora did not turn to compare them again. The guide had already allowed for their present fullness. The old drawing could rest without another observation. She tied the middle folder with the same light bow. The second elevation was settled. At the first folder, the drawn awnings rested beneath the protective leaf in their earlier arrangement. Across the harbor, the present awnings might still be extended, rolled, or partly lowered, but their positions no longer mattered to the work on the table. The guide recorded the roofs and left the fabric free to vary. Nora closed the folder board. She drew its ties together and formed the final bow. All 3 elevation folders were now closed. She stood beside them for a moment, looking along the short row. Their outer surfaces were plain. Nothing on them announced the changes in awnings, trees, roof lines, or water light. The catalog slips held the useful wording: and the atlas guides held the usable comparisons. The old drawings needed only their usual shelter. Nora returned her hands to her sides. The table looked calmer with the folders tied. The working notes still lay beside the open atlas in their proper order. Jonas's blue pencil instruction remained with the elevation records. It had guided the evening without becoming part of the finished comparison. Begin with light, not measurements. The line could stay where it was for the next reader of the catalog record. Nora did not add another note. The approved guide said enough. She moved to the shallow tool tray. The paper guards had already been stacked. She checked their edges and left them together. The small ruler lay flat. The pencil point faced inward. Her bone folder rested where she had placed it, its pale surface smooth and familiar. Nora touched the bone folder once with the side of her finger. It had relaxed the curling film and settled the protective leaves. No sharper crease had been needed. No permanent fold had been made. The evening's changes were held by alignment, sequence, and clear instruction rather than force. She left the bone folder in the tray. The soft weights remained near the supports where they had held the transparent film flat. Nora lifted the nearest one and placed it in the shallow tray. She added the second beside it, then the others, one at a time. Each left the support unchanged. The clear working surfaces no longer required restraint. The guides were already in their atlas pockets. When the final soft weight had returned to the tray, Nora aligned the small paper guards beside the ruler. She made no effort to arrange them more precisely than use required. They lay flat, they were clean, and they would be easy to reach during another shift. The tray was complete. Nora looked toward the viewing frame. It leaned on its padded support near the side of the table. The felt strips protected, and the reference marks visible along the wood. Earlier, those marks had divided roof lines, sky, walls, and trees into a field the eye could carry back to the cream paper. Now the frame was simply at rest. She checked its balance with one hand. It did not shift. She removed her hand and left it there. The 3 window recesses remained empty. Their painted sills bore no mark from the frame's felt. The glass held no film, fastener, or label. Each bay had been returned to the same physical state in which Nora had found it. Only the atlas remained open. It rested after the garden index, close enough to the final bay for the window reflection to cross its clear pockets. The 3 new packets lay in order. Their graphite lines appeared and softened as the water light changed in the glass behind Nora. She moved beside the atlas and looked down. The first guide held its brief roof sequence. The middle guide held the low wall and 2 separated roof strokes. The final guide held the broader rise of the roofs above an open lower field. Their catalog slips named the bays and explained the paired ticks. Nothing more crowded the transparent film. Nothing had been attached to the elevations. Nothing had been added to the windows. The window comparison work was complete. Nora allowed the statement to settle without ceremony. The elevations had been matched to their 3 established positions. The pinpricks had been understood as part of a practical viewing method. The transparent guides had been prepared, tested one variable at a time, and approved for the reading sequence. The drawings were protected in their tied folders. The frame and tools had returned to rest. There was no further action hidden inside the task. Nora placed her fingertips on the empty protective flap beyond the 3rd atlas pocket. She lifted it slightly, confirmed that the packet beneath lay square, and lowered it again. The flap settled over the final guide without moving its catalog slip. The atlas remained open at the window sequence, ready for Jonas to see in daylight. She did not close it. She did not place a weight on it. The approved material had entered the atlas, but the atlas itself was not being bound tonight. Its pages needed only to rest in their present order. Nora drew her hand away. The garden index remained immediately before the window guides. Nothing had shifted in the earlier material. The atlas had received the evening's work without requiring the established pages to be revisited. That sequence now rested quietly on the stand. Nora looked once at the closed elevation folders, once at the orderly tray, and once at the viewing frame. These were not new checks. They were the final shape of actions already carried out. Folders tied, tools settled, frame supported, atlas open at the approved guides. The gallery had become still around them. Nora returned to the final bay. She followed the shortest line from the atlas stand to the familiar place before the glass. She did not stop at the middle window or glance through the first. Their proportions were already held in memory. The first bay's quicker steps of roof, the middle bay's wall and trees, the final bay's broader rise above a larger measure of water. Her feet settled at the same comfortable distance as before. Outside, the harbor had darkened by another small degree. The roof lines remained visible, though their colors had drawn closer together. The setback addition no longer caught much separate light. It belonged to the same calm silhouette as the older roofs, visible without needing emphasis. Below, the reflected lamps were clearer. Their vertical bands moved slowly across the sheltered water. Each band appeared continuous for a moment, then broke where a small fold crossed it. The pieces did not scatter. They remained near one another and joined again. Nora watched without counting the movement. The glass now gave back more of the room. The cream elevation folders appeared as three pale rectangles along the table. Their ties were too fine to show clearly from where she stood, but the closed boards made an even sequence. The shallow tray reflected as a darker shape, with a narrow pale line where the bone folder rested. The viewing frame appeared near the edge of the pane, upright on its support. The atlas formed the lightest shape of all. Its open leaves floated over the harbor reflection, and the transparent pockets caught the lamps in small muted lines. The guide marks could not be read from the window. They no longer needed to be. Their presence was enough. 3 approved aids resting after the garden index, ready for another person to lift and carry to the proper bay. Nora's own reflection remained faint. A dark sleeve appeared when she moved one hand. The outline faded when she let the hand rest again. Her face was not a separate image so much as part of the gallery's returning light, held gently on the surface of the pane. She stood without adjusting her position. The final view had become familiar enough that she no longer assembled it from parts. She did not need to say low wall, first rise, second rise, farther roof. The whole proportion arrived at once, as the shape of this bay. The same was true of the room behind her. She knew where the tied folders rested. She knew the position of the tool tray and the frame. She knew the atlas was open at the new sequence. Nothing asked her to turn and confirm it again. The evening had moved from harbor light on cream paper to cream paper reflected in darkening glass. At the beginning, the rectangular patch of light had made the elevation luminous. It had crossed drawn windows and roof lines, while the room itself stayed quiet around it. Now the direction seemed reversed. The gallery lamps gave the paper back to the window, and the pane laid the pale table across the water. The old drawing remained protected. The harbor remained beyond the glass. The reflection joined them without making either one less distinct. Nora breathed in slowly and let the breath leave at the same pace. The water pressed softly against the quay below. Its low fold reached the gallery, followed by the gentler sound of retreat. A second fold came after it, similar but not identical. Between them, the room held its own silence. No dialogue belonged here now. Jonas's blue pencil words had already done their work. Nora's graphite slips carried the practical directions. The rest could remain in light, proportion, and the slow movement below. She let her gaze rest on the lower part of the window. A lamp reflection stretched upward through the image of the atlas. The water shortened it, and the clear, reflected pocket seemed to dim. Then the band lengthened again, passing beneath the reflected cream folders without disturbing their shape. The transparent guides had been made for exactly this freedom. They held the stable lines and left the changing light alone. Nora's hands rested easily, one over the other. The walk to the chart house had long since left her legs. The hours of standing and moving between the three bays had settled into a comfortable heaviness rather than fatigue. Her body had taken on the stillness of the final room. Balanced, unhurried, ready to stop. The final bay no longer felt like the far end of a route. It was simply the place where the route rested. Behind her, the first and middle windows had their empty sills and unmarked glass. The table between them held the closed drawings and the completed tools. The atlas carried the guides forward in its established order. Nothing needed to travel back through the building tonight. The window reflection strengthened. The harbor roofs beyond it softened. Not because anything had changed in their structure, but because the room had become the brighter side of the glass. Their broad sequence remained present under the reflected table. The pale wall merged gently with the cream shapes of the folders. The water continued below both. Nora did not try to choose one view over the other. She could see the harbor through the gallery and the gallery through the harbor. The old elevations were no longer exposed on the table. Yet their cream paper returned in the pane. The frame was no longer at the sill, yet its quiet rectangle appeared near the window's edge. The reflected lamps rose from the room, while their longer counterparts moved on the water. Everything remained where it belonged. Another slow fold of water reached the quay. The sound entered, softened, and passed. Nora's gaze lifted from the reflected atlas to the roofs beyond it. For a moment, the farther roofline became clear again. Then the light inside the gallery settled more fully onto the glass, and the roof became a darker line beneath the pale image of the table. The tied folders rested within that image. The tool tray rested. The viewing frame rested. The reading room atlas remained open at the three completed guides. Nora stayed at the final bay, her stance easy and familiar. Below, the water moved in sheltered bands. Across it, the lamps lengthened and shortened without hurry. On the pane, cream paper and reflected light gathered into a calm, steady surface. Little by little, the window reflection became clearer than the harbor beyond it.